Clutching the forged Omega medical report, I stepped into the sprawling luxury estate, fully expecting to be greeted by a frail, sickly old man with one foot in the grave. Instead, the second I pushed the heavy doors open, the young alpha behind the desk looked up, revealing a face with striking, impossibly deep contours. He wasn't just breathtakingly young and handsome. He was overwhelmingly built, radiating the kind of raw, commanding physicality that could easily end me with a single punch. Half a month later, drowning in an inescapable, scorching storm of shadows and light, the corners of my eyes flushed a desperate red. On the verge of a total breakdown, I shoved hard against the blistering chest bearing down on me. I'm done. I'm actually a beta. I can't even get pregnant. The boiling dark gold aura in the room froze in a terrifying unnatural stillness. Christopher arched a single brow. In a flash, his massive sculpted hand shot out, pinning both of my wrists to the soft pillows above my head with absolute domination. A beta, huh? He closed in, his raspy voice brushing right against the shell of my ear as a lethally dangerous smirk curled his lips. Then we're just going to have to work even harder. Main text. Clutching the forged Omega medical report, Arthur made his way down the third-floor corridor, his footsteps sinking into the thick wool carpet. This was supposed to be a desperate gamble for cash, a job his uncle had set up to provide an heir for a lonely, dying old alpha. As a beta utterly incapable of getting pregnant, Arthur had planned to fake his way through it, snatch the massive deposit to clear his debts, and run. The intricate damask wallpaper and crystal chandeliers blurred past in his peripheral vision, all the tedious background details cast aside until the butler pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the study. Soft afternoon sunlight filtered through the floor, to ceiling windows, casting a warm, pale gold halo across the expansive rosewood desk. Arthur's pupils dilated. Behind the desk, the man set down his documents and looked up, revealing a face with impossibly striking, chiseled features. There was no sickbed. There was no frail old man. The sunlight traced the sharp lines of his broad, commanding shoulders and long, powerful fingers. The air itself seemed to hum with a visible, shimmering heat wave, the unmistakable, irresistible magnetism of a top-tier alpha bleeding effortlessly into the room. Arthur, is it? Frozen in place, Arthur swallowed hard, taking a long moment to force the words through his dry throat. Mr. Christopher? Christopher leaned forward slightly, the golden light rippling around him in a dizzying, intoxicating warmth. Do you remember me? Arthur's gaze swept over that flawless face, his mind frantically sifting through fragments of old part-time jobs, but ultimately, he could only offer an honest shake of his head. The second he denied it, the bright golden halo in the study visibly dimmed, and even the dust motes dancing in the air seemed to turn heavy. Christopher lowered his thick lashes with a quiet hum of acknowledgement, a nameless sense of disappointment settling into his rigid jawline. Standing in the shadows of the hallway, Arthur gripped his phone, his knuckles turning white from the strain. Over the line, his uncle's voice dripped with guilt, constantly dangling that $1 million deposit and their future escape plan to pacify him. Arthur closed his eyes and took a deep breath, burying the surge of frustration burning in his chest. The money. He needed this cash too badly. A sliver of warm light spilled from the half-open study door. Just as Arthur approached, he caught the butler's hushed voice. Sir, when I brought Mr. Arthur in earlier, I noticed his walking posture was a bit unnatural. For the sake of your heir's genetics, should we arrange another physical exam? Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He pushed the door open and strode right into that pool of warm light, bypassing the desk to close the distance between him and Christopher. Without a second of hesitation, Arthur hooked his fingers under the two thin black straps resting at the edge of his waistband and yanked them up. The dark silk ribbons cut a sharp, striking contrast against his pale waist, blindingly vivid under the warm glow of the desk lamp. I'm not sick. I just walk weird because wearing this is uncomfortable. Arthur's eyes went wide with sudden urgency. It was as if Christopher's calm composure caught fire. A faint flush crawled rapidly from his neck to his sharp cheekbones, the veins on the back of his hands popping from the sheer, instant tension. The air around them warped violently, the light shifting into a heavy, viscous dark orange, as if something scorching hot was quietly waking up. Looking slightly undone, the alpha raised a hand, pressing his fingertips hard against his brow, before swiftly pulling a contract from the pile and sliding it across the desk. Sign it, if there are no issues. The moment the pen left the paper, Christopher's massive frame was already crowding in. He dipped his head, his nose brushing against the side of Arthur's neck, taking in a deep, dragging breath. The dark orange shadows in the room seemed to manifest into tangible vines, wrapping around them with a gentle yet inescapable gravity. But as a beta, Arthur could only feel that suffocating, intoxicating heat. He couldn't catch a single trace of pheromones. "I took suppressants before I came," Arthur lied, biting down softly on his lower lip. Christopher let out a muffled hum, his arms snapping tight around him. The world spun, and Arthur's feet left the ground, caught in a firm, unrelenting hold. Pure instinct kicking in, Arthur kicked his legs, struggling pointlessly in mid-air while his fingertips dug desperately into the Alpha's expensive dress shirt. Christopher's strength was overwhelming, one hand locked around his waist like an iron band, the other gripping his collarbone. The man buried his face into the crook of Arthur's neck like a massive hound, utterly starved for security, who had finally found his master. Wet, searing kisses left vivid, burning marks against his skin. Behind the bookshelf lay a hidden door, opening into a sprawling bedroom, drenched in soft ambient light. Arthur was tossed onto the center of a massive bed, the mattress so soft he felt himself sink right into it. Christopher's breathing was heavy and ragged. His long fingers tore directly at his own collar. With the dull sound of ripping fabric, several custom, high-end buttons snapped off, scattering across the hardwood floor with sharp, clear clicks. Arthur scrambled to roll over, his fingertips barely brushing against a cold, discarded button before a tidal wave of blistering heat blanketed him from behind. The dark orange shadows in the room completely boiled over, burning away any last shreds of reason. Arthur was forced to tilt his head back, the corners of his eyes flushed with a desperate, breathless red. "Boss," his voice trembled, "I don't have any experience at all. Can you take it easy on me?" Christopher's movements ground to a halt, his chest heaving violently. He looked down, his gaze dark and entirely focused in the dim, warm light, offering a silent vow. "Don't worry. I won't let you be uncomfortable." But when it actually began, Arthur realized just how wildly wrong he was. He was trapped in an inescapable mire of liquid heat. Every time he tried to slip away, those powerful arms dragged him right back into the eye of the storm. The warping shadows and blistering temperatures completely swallowed him whole. He felt like he was melting down to his core, molded and folded into countless positions against the plush mattress until even his fingertips shook to their absolute limit under the warm yellow glow. Arthur's thoughts began to drift in the hazy light, his fingers instinctively digging hard into the Alpha's tense back. Christopher's rhythm stalled. The dim bedside lamp flickered as if the connection was loose, and the soft orange glow instantly erupted with scorching tension. The air shimmered with a visible dark red heat wave, like dying embers roaring back to life. Arthur frantically pressed his hands against that solid, burning chest, his long lashes fluttering. "Can we take a break? My back is killing me." The dark fire in Christopher's eyes danced wildly. His Adam's apple bobbed with a heavy swallow. He let out a breathless "okay" before spreading his arms, rolling Arthur over onto the soft mattress, yet his movements didn't skip a single beat. This will be better. The endless tug of war finally came to a halt. Wrapped in a thin velvet blanket, Arthur lay paralyzed near the edge of the bed, the exhaustion bleeding all the way down to his trembling fingertips. The soft click of a drawer opening sounded from behind him, and a second later, a touch of something icy cold pressed against his spine. Arthur jumped, his flushed eyes going wide as he scrambled to block it. "Boss?" "Putting on some medicine." Christopher's face looked incredibly calm under the warm light, yet the blistering aura surrounding him showed absolutely no signs of fading. Weighed down by the guilt of his fake identity, Arthur forced himself up to grab the ointment. "I'll do it myself." Christopher's knuckles tightened as he smoothly dodged the attempt. His tone was an undeniable anchor. "I'll do it." Unable to get out of it, Arthur tried to lean into a bit of professionalism to mask his inner panic. "I'll help. You go ahead." However, the icy relief he expected from the ointment never lasted. Instead, it was replaced by a staggering, all-consuming heat pressing down on him. The shadows that had just begun to settle twisted violently once more. The dark orange light flooded back in like a rising tide, swallowing them completely. Christopher's low, raspy voice brushed right against his ear. "Let's go again." Morning sunlight flooded the dining room, washing over a table laden with an exquisite breakfast spread. Rubbing his aching lower back, Arthur stared down, scrolling through his phone. On the screen were his uncle's strict instructions, urging him to act completely intoxicated by the premium alpha's pheromones, just like how money pulls you in. Staring at that line, Arthur felt the dull ache in his spine flare up even more. The crab roe bun in his hand instantly lost its appeal. As night fell, the crystal chandelier cast a cozy, warm yellow glow. Christopher shrugged off his suit jacket, his long, sculpted fingers slowly unfastening his watch. Yet, his dark, bottomless gaze felt almost tangible, clinging to every inch of Arthur's skin. Under the sheer weight of his stare, the air around them rippled with waves of bright, intoxicating gold. "How are you holding up?" Arthur cursed him out in his head, but managed to plaster on a perfectly pitched, bashful smile, lowering his eyelashes. "I'm fine, thank you." A faint smirk played on Christopher's lips as he flawlessly deboned the most tender cut of fish, placing it directly into Arthur's bowl. Throughout the entire evening, the quiet check-ins, the meticulous way he served his food and poured his water, all blending with the room's gentle lighting, it almost tricked Arthur into the delusion of being deeply cherished, like falling into a dark, irresistible romance. A few nights later at the dinner table, Arthur studied that flawlessly handsome face bathed in the warm light and decided to execute his uncle's take the initiative strategy. He didn't even bother faking an expression, dropping the question point blank. "Are we continuing tonight?" The words barely left his mouth before Christopher's hand froze mid-motion. It was as if all the oxygen in the softly lit dining room was instantly sucked out. The air warped violently around them, flashing with a blinding dark gold as the alpha's arousal spiked. In the very next heartbeat, Christopher scooped Arthur right out of his chair, steadying his dinner plate in the same fluid motion. "All right. Well, finish the rest upstairs." For the days that followed, Christopher operated like a tireless, relentless machine. If Arthur showed even the slightest hint of accommodation, the air around them would immediately boil over into a golden heatwave. And then, swept up in that inescapable magnetism, Arthur would be dragged right back into the center of that massive king-sized bed. Finally hitting a much-needed rest day, Arthur took advantage of the dead of night, slipping quietly from that scorching embrace and ducking under the bed like an ostrich hiding in the sand. Yet, the next morning, what woke him was still the same wet, grazing bite against his neck. Somewhere along the line, Christopher had hauled him right back into the plush warmth of the covers. Long, powerful fingers locked around his wrists, the alpha murmured right against the corner of his flushed lips. "Break time is over." Half a month of relentless day, and night labor completely shattered Arthur's defenses. His eyes flushed with sheer desperation. Pushing hard against the massive frame looming over him, his voice cracked wildly in the warm yellow bedroom. "I'm actually a beta." The frantic swaying of the bed curtains snapped to a halt. Christopher propped himself up on his solid forearms, his chest heaving, his dark bottomless gaze nailed to Arthur's nervously twisted fingers. The boiling dark gold shadows in the air froze instantly. "A beta?" Nodding frantically like he had just been granted a pardon, Arthur practically tripped over his words to distance himself. "I'm a beta. I can't get pregnant. I'm so sorry I lied to you." A dead silence followed. Then, instead of dying out, the frozen dark gold aura multiplied at a terrifying speed, expanding until the entire room felt dragged into the blinding scorching core of the sun. Christopher cocked a brow, a dangerous, utterly possessive smirk curling the corner of his mouth. He caught Arthur's thrashing hands, pinning them effortlessly into the soft pillows above his head with pure domination. "If you're a beta, then we're just going to have to work even harder." The scorching heat crashed down on him, wildly overwhelming and more fierce than ever before. At dawn, Arthur lay completely wrecked amongst the tangled sheets, gritting his teeth as he texted his uncle about the entire blowout. The other end of the screen stayed silent for a long time before a reply finally popped up. His uncle tried to reassure him, guessing Christopher probably just thought it was a joke, and casually tossed him a novel titled The Fragile Omega Survival Guide to study. Arthur scrolled through his screen. The Omega in the novel spent every night playing house with their sugar daddy, only to spend the days anxiously helping the mansion maid clean up. Staring at the text, his brow furrowed hard. He couldn't wrap his head around such a ridiculous train of thought. If you're worked half to death at night, why the hell would you go scrub floors during the day? Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, scattering warm, tranquil patches of light across the carpet. Absolutely exasperated, Arthur slammed his phone face down on the pillow. He tugged the velvet duvet, still holding the sunlight and the alpha's lingering warmth, tightly around himself, and with pure entitlement, slammed the call button by the bed. "Ma'am, please bring my lunch up to the room." Rubbing his aching lower back, Arthur boredly pushed open the the slightly ajar carved wooden doors of the study. On the sprawling rosewood desk, the pale blue glow of a monitor cast a quiet light in the dim room. A few foreign language documents lay haphazardly across the surface. Figuring he had nothing better to do anyway, Arthur dropped into the oversized leather chair, grabbed the mouse, and started translating. Once a person zones in, time vanishes. By the time Arthur rubbed his strained eyes and looked up, the twilight outside had been entirely swallowed by the deep night. There were no footsteps. At some point, a tall, commanding silhouette had materialized right next to the back of his chair, in total silence. Sorry. Startled, Arthur shot up from the chair, scrambling out of the way. I was just a little bored, so I translated a bit. Looking completely unbothered, Christopher took over the mouse. His massive frame leaned in slightly, his knuckles sliding slowly along the edge of the screen. As he drew near, the cold, pale blue glow of the monitor seemed infected by an invisible, heated current, gradually bleeding into a visible, soft amber halo. These 3 spots have errors. The rest is perfect. Christopher's profound gaze shifted from the screen to Arthur, a flicker of genuine approval lighting up his dark eyes. His deep, gravelly voice echoed through the quiet study, carrying an irresistible magnetism as he meticulously pointed out the minor flaws. That level of intense focus made Arthur's mind drift for a split second. It was almost like flashing back to his childhood, before his family went bankrupt, when his private language tutor would patiently guide him. Want to consider working for my company later on? Christopher suddenly turned his head, the amber light casting intoxicating shadows across his chiseled features. I'll give you a better package than any other place out there. Arthur's heart gave a violent flinch. With only a high school diploma, forget top-tier packages, he wouldn't even make it past the resume screening at a standard company. But right on the heels of that thought, a bone-deep chill shot up from his heels. If he stayed here, this cheap scam of a beta playing an Omega would eventually be completely torn apart. He suppressed a shiver, forcing his gaze away and stiffly changing the subject. I think we should finish the job at hand before worrying about anything else. You're right. Christopher gave a slight nod. The very next second, a solid, scorching arm hooked inescapably around Arthur's waist, and the amber halo instantly boiled over. Let's go. Desperate to escape Christopher's terrifying diligence, Arthur started a futile game of hide and seek. Yet, no matter how obscure the guest room he tucked himself into at night, a pair of scorching arms would always hunt him down flawlessly in the dead of sleep. Head be scooped up, blankets and all, and hauled right back to the massive bed in the master suite. Since hiding wasn't working, Arthur pivoted his strategy. He began to play the part of the desperately infatuated, hopelessly clingy lover, hoping that an overdose of cloying, needy demands would finally disgust the untouchable billionaire. But he miscalculated. Completely. Inside the sprawling executive study, Arthur draped his soft frame across Christopher's tailored suit, clad lap. Despite the live video briefing with his subordinates, Christopher didn't just let him stay. The massive hand anchored at Arthur's waist clamped down even tighter. Every subtle squirm, every attempt Arthur made to slip away, was instantly crushed by an inescapable gravity, pulling him right back against that searing chest. As their gazes locked, the previously warm golden halo in the room began to curdle and warp. Right before his eyes, it darkened into a heavy, suffocating, fiercely aggressive burnt orange. The sheer staggering possessiveness pooling in those dark, bottomless eyes sent a violent shiver straight down Arthur's spine. Just as Christopher raised a hand to kill the monitor screen, Arthur panicked, slamming his own hands over those sculpted knuckles. Christopher paused. He looked down at the trembling figure in his lap, clearly jumping to a wildly different conclusion. You want to do it here? There were no wasted words. Just a single, jagged second of silence. With a violent sweep of his long arm, a deafening crash tore through the room as a mountain of files was cleared from the desk. Countless white sheets fluttered like snow in slow motion through the heavy, dark orange shadows. In a flash, that towering, scorching frame eclipsed him, pinning Arthur with absolute domination against the hard mahogany surface. Tell me if it's too much. We can go back to the bedroom. A month later, the sheer physical and mental exhaustion finally broke Arthur. Gritting his teeth, he slammed the forged pregnancy medical report, courtesy of his uncle, flat onto the desk. The thin sheet of paper trembled faintly beneath Arthur's bloodless fingertips. Christopher took the report. Those sharp brows pulled together for a fraction of a second before a stunning, overwhelmingly tender smile slowly unfurled at the corners of his mouth. The butler standing nearby, however, furrowed his brow, his cold, hypercritical gaze sweeping over the document. You should have informed me of something this critical beforehand. Going out alone in your condition is reckless. For the health of both Mr. Arthur and the heir, I believe it would be best to schedule a comprehensive workup at a more authoritative hospital. Arthur cursed the obnoxious butler 100 times over in his head. Taking a deep breath, he wielded the baby card as his absolute shield. He took a bold step forward, his soft fingertips expertly catching the crisp edge of Christopher's shirt cuff, giving it a gentle tug. Forcing a pathetic, flushed rim of tears to his eyes, he dropped his voice to a whisper. I just went to the hospital today. I don't want to go back. I hate the smell of that place. Christopher froze, his knuckles resting against his jaw. He looked down at the pale hand clinging to his sleeve. The suffocating tension in the study melted instantly, dissolving into a dizzying, warm, pale, gold aura that felt like the first breath of spring. All right. From that day forward, Christopher morphed into a relentless work. From home guardian, he swallowed every single one of Arthur's escalating, bratty demands without blinking. I want to drink this. Never mind, get me a different flavor. He took it all in stride, answering every whim with a low, infinitely patient, all right, or Yet, this obsessive shadow, like surveillance, made Arthur's skin crawl. I want to go out shopping. Pick up some things I'm going to need. Arthur ventured tentatively, glancing at the man reviewing files on the couch. All right, I'll come with you. Christopher agreed without missing a beat, instantly snapping the folder shut and rising to his feet. I really don't need a babysitter, Arthur groaned internally. He didn't want company. He just wanted to wander around and breathe on his own. After hours of relentless whining and pleading, Arthur finally won the right to leave the house solo. But while Christopher had granted him an exit pass, he had completely forgotten to give him any money. Left with no choice, Arthur turned into a deeply bitter shadow, pacing aggressively around the mansion in his coat. When Christopher worked, Arthur circled his desk. When Christopher went to pour water, Arthur tailed him. Seeing the man remain as utterly oblivious as a brick wall, Arthur finally snapped. He slammed to a halt right in front of Christopher and violently yanked both of his coat pockets inside out. Two sad, empty white flaps of fabric dangled limply at his hips like a pair of depressed rabbit ears. That finally caught Christopher's attention. The clacking of the keyboard stopped. A look of dawn breaking, followed by a deeply amused smile, surfaced in his dark eyes. He stood up, closing the distance between them, and leaned his towering, magnetic frame down. With agonizing patience and absolute tenderness, his long fingers tucked those two inside-out pockets back into place, before smoothly pulling the zipper of Arthur's coat all the way up. There we go. Christopher straightened up, a warm, pale gold halo radiating around him. He lowered his thick lashes, staring down at Arthur. A bright, eager glimmer danced in those bottomless eyes, like a massive, devoted hound intensely waiting for its master to praise it. Arthur's mouth twitched completely out of his control. Staring in pure despair, he forced the words out. No, I mean, when it's time to pay. The warm golden aura in the room hit a violent wall. The eager glimmer in Christopher's eyes, along with that flawless, devoted smile, froze instantly on his striking face. Armed with Christopher's black card, Arthur was like a bird uncaged, diving into luxury boutiques on wild shopping sprees every other day. But what truly gave him a secret thrill was the fact that ever since he dropped the pregnancy bombshell, it was as if someone had hit the pause button on Christopher. The man locked away every ounce of his aggressive dominance, and, after Arthur threw a massive fit, had even silently relocated his pillows to the adjoining guest room. At long last, Arthur had that sprawling, ridiculously oversized custom bed in the master suite entirely to himself. It was dead into the night. Arthur kicked his latest haul of designer shopping bags into a corner, just like always. Maybe it was the black coffee he had chugged that afternoon to keep his energy up, but even after a hot shower, he lay on the plush mattress with his mind racing, utterly wired. The hands of the wall clock swept silently past 1 a.m. Click! The terrifyingly soft snap of a metal lock mechanism tumbling was magnified 100 times in the dead, quiet bedroom. The muscles in Arthur's spine locked up instantly, every hair on his body standing on end. He held his breath, freezing completely in his curled, up position. Footsteps sank into the thick wool carpet, slow, methodical, like an elegant predator patrolling its territory, drawing closer and closer. Through a sliver of weak streetlight bleeding past the curtains, the corner of Arthur's eye caught a towering, unmistakable silhouette. It was Christopher. Arthur's heart, which had been lodged in his throat, settled slightly, but an even deeper wave of confusion and unease immediately took its place. 1 in the morning. What is he doing here? Is he pissed that I swiped his card too hard? The mattress dipped ever so slightly. Christopher's movements were so gentle, they bordered on reverent. He lifted the edge of the velvet blanket, and a chest radiating that familiar blistering heat pressed flush against Arthur's back. With a low, deeply suppressed sigh, the man's solid arms locked him firmly into a suffocating embrace. At that exact moment, Arthur had never been more thankful to be a beta. Because right then and there, he could vividly feel the freezing air in the bedroom being rapidly swallowed by an invisible, magma-like current of heat. If he were an Omega, the intoxicating heavy weight of those pheromones would have blown his cover instantly. As for what would happen next, Arthur didn't even dare to imagine. Just as Arthur thought tonight's surprise was over, those hands, which had behaved for barely a few minutes, began to wander upward along his waist. Softly, yet with an inescapable magnetism, they slipped under the hem of his silk pajamas. The buttons were undone one by one. The chill of the night air, and those blistering fingertips, took turns trailing across his bare skin. When the last layer of defense was stripped away, Christopher's massive hand clamped down on Arthur's shoulder with absolute domination, easily flipping his bored, stiff body over. And then, that towering, scorching frame slipped entirely under the covers. In the pitch black, Arthur bit down hard on his lip, screaming internally, "Holy shit, what a freak." As it turned out, expecting a fake pregnancy to buy him any peace was a complete pipe dream. The hunger Christopher buried beneath his refined, gentlemanly facade was like a dormant volcano, forever trembling on the edge of a violent eruption. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the floor, to ceiling windows onto the dining table, but it couldn't melt the ice pooling in Arthur's chest. Sitting on Christopher's lap, he stared at the silver spoon offered to his lips and instinctively turned his head away. Planting his hands against the man's solid chest, he tried to push back against that intoxicating, inescapable hold. Yet, for every inch he struggled, the iron band around his waist tightened by 2. A heart, stopping, violently burning dark gold halo began to ripple through the air around them. Arthur's senses flared as he picked up on something unspeakably dangerous, pressing hard against his thigh. He froze instantly, not even daring to breathe too hard. "Go ahead. Move again." Christopher's raspy voice brushed right against his ear. His bottomless eyes churned with naked, unbridled hunger, and even the tips of his ears carried a faint, telling flush. That scorching gaze dragged slowly down Arthur's cheek like a physical flame, making his entire body tingle with electric heat. He couldn't drag this out any longer. Warning bells were screaming in Arthur's head. "I have to run. Now." He had run the calculations flawlessly. Every morning between 9 and noon was Christopher's absolute, untouchable meeting time in the study. During that exact window, the hawk-eyed butler never ventured upstairs to disturb him. And by 10, the maids were entirely occupied down in the kitchen. Next Tuesday, the escape plan would officially go live. It was an adrenaline-spiked day. Wearing a backpack stuffed with luxury watches, Arthur vaulted over the second-floor balcony like a stray cat. He shimmied down the drainpipe, dodged the blind spots of the security cameras, and dove straight into his uncle's beat-up, roaring 3-wheeler waiting just outside the estate. With a casual flick of his uncle's cigarette butt, the rusty engine coughed out a cloud of black smoke and tore off into the distance. The most dangerous place is the safest place. Following his uncle's lead, Arthur vanished into a remote mountain village on the very edge of the city, a place with terrible roads and cell service that dropped every other minute. Living off the massive deposit that still left them flush with cash, even after clearing their debts, the two of them lived like kings in total isolation. 2 months later, pinching the soft layer of padding that had quietly appeared around his waist, Arthur lay paralyzed on a hard wooden bed, so bored he was practically growing mold. He held up his phone, capitalizing on a rare moment of full reception to boot up a competitive game he hadn't touched in ages. From the people you may know list, he casually invited a random profile picture to party up. "Hey man, what role do you play?" Arthur asked, his tone light and breezy over his cheap headset. The other guy didn't use a mic, opting to type in the team chat instead. Over the next few matches, this stranger, with his flawlessly smooth mechanics, surprisingly mild temper, and absolute devotion to Arthur's shot, calling, quickly won him over. After a few straight days of hardcore duo queuing, it felt completely natural for Arthur to ask for his number. The exact second that string of digits popped up, a bizarre sense of familiarity slithered up Arthur's spine like a cold-blooded viper. Staring at the screen, his fingertips trembling slightly, he tentatively typed out, "By the way, what's your name?" On the other end, the guy replied instantly with a gentle smiley face, followed by a name that sent Arthur plunging straight into an ice bath. Christopher. Added the number in the morning. By noon, a convoy of armored black SUVs was crushing the quiet dirt road at the entrance of the village. In the back seat of the stretched Lincoln on the way back, the atmosphere was so heavy you could wring water from it. Even as a beta, Arthur could tell by the pale, sweat-drenched faces of the two bodyguards in the front that the pheromone concentration inside the cabin had skyrocketed to an utterly terrifying, lethal extreme. Click. With a soft mechanical hum, the heavy, semi-transparent privacy partition rolled up between them and the driver's seat, cleanly severing his final lifeline. Arthur shrank into the corner like a terrified quail, every hair on his body standing on end. Christopher had his long legs elegantly crossed. Those bottomless eyes, which used to overflow with tender smiles, were now as cold as ice, forged blades. The air around him warped into a suffocating, violent, dark red, like a massive thunderstorm ready to break. "Why did you run? I've been looking for you for so long." Christopher's voice was impossibly soft, yet it smashed into Arthur's chest like a sledgehammer. "I gave you a place to live. I fed you. I gave you everything you ever asked for." His voice abruptly cut off. The churning dark red storm inside the cabin froze in a terrifying stillness. In the depths of those frigid eyes, an intoxicating, breathtaking madness, tangled with a hidden, bleeding sense of betrayal. Arthur's scalp went completely numb. His instincts screamed that there was a terrifying, deeply twisted loophole hidden in the man's words, but he had no time to dig into it. Bracing himself, he forced out a dry, hollow laugh that looked worse than crying. I was just messing around with you." Christopher stared at him. Suddenly, he let out a low, breathless laugh that echoed through the sealed cabin, freezing the marrow in Arthur's bones. Later that night, pressed hard against the massive floor, ceiling windows, Arthur was entirely consumed by a violent, scorching storm of kisses, sobbing breathlessly as he gave in. Christopher's solid jaw dug into his shoulder blades, now painted with vivid red marks, while his sharp canines sank heavily into Arthur's sensitive earlobe. A fiercely exploding dark gold shadow swallowed them whole, and the man's low, lethally dark voice detonated right beside his ear. "Why are you crying?" "I'm just messing around with you." Thick steam rolled over the oversized, custom double bathtub. Perhaps out of consideration for the non-existent baby, this breathtaking lesson in absolute domination didn't last too long. In the warm, rippling water, Christopher's long fingers gently traced the rough calluses on Arthur's palms, the undeniable scars left behind by years of grueling labor. A breathtakingly faint, soothing pale, gold halo flowed quietly through the air around them. "You really don't remember me?" Leaning against the edge of the bathtub, a flicker of confusion crossed Arthur's eyes. Childhood memories flashed through his mind like fragmented film stock. When he was 8, his parents had brought home a beautiful boy 4 years his junior. It was his arranged childhood fiancé. Yet, those warm flashbacks were ruthlessly severed by a brutal reality: tens of millions in crushing debt, the icy seal placed on their family mansion, the forced withdrawal from school, and the pale, exhausted faces of his parents before they passed away from sheer overwork. Over a decade of devastating freefall was entirely glossed over by Arthur, with just a few light, dismissive sighs. Hearing what Arthur's family had endured, a chilling, terrifying darkness violently ripped through the depths of Christopher's eye. The gentle pale gold halo in the bathroom instantly lost control, the invisible seething fury physically tearing through the rising steam. "After I lost contact with you, I had my family look for you. They told me you moved." The muscles in Christopher's jaw pulled dangerously tight, his knuckles turning a stark white. "It wasn't until later that I found out they only paid lip service. The absolute second your family went bankrupt, they instantly cut all ties. I'm so sorry. I was too young to help you back then. I let you suffer so much out there." The towering man suddenly tightened his arms, locking Arthur entirely into his scorching embrace. In the dead, quiet bathroom, Arthur felt drops of warm liquid land in the crook of his neck. He couldn't tell if it was water dripping from the alpha's hair or the man's fiercely suppressed tears, but it left a trail of blistering heat as it slid silently down his pale shoulder blades. Buried in this embrace wrapped in dark gold shadows, Arthur lowered his trembling eyelashes. The bitter ache in his chest entirely tangled with a hidden, breathless rush of secret ecstasy. It wasn't until the bathwater began to run cold that the violently surging pheromone storm completely settled. Arthur turned around in the water. Lifting a wet fingertip, he gently brushed away the striking, vivid red at the corner of Christopher's eye. But as the pad of his finger traced the man's flawless brow bone, a terrifying realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Wait a second. Arthur's hand froze mid-air, his eyes going wide. I remember. Weren't you an Omega back then? Christopher caught his dripping wrist with a backhand grip, arching a single brow. And weren't you an Alpha? A flash of absolute dimness crossed Arthur's eyes. He was, once. But the endless, heavy manual labor and severe malnutrition had brutally choked out his presentation phase. His atrophied glands had ultimately reduced him to nothing more than an ordinary, unremarkable beta. When I turned 17, I presented as an alpha. I only found out at the hospital that the initial diagnosis was completely wrong. Christopher's gaze was like an open flame, trailing slowly down the delicate curve of Arthur's collarbone. The air around them rippled once more with a dangerous, thick, and intoxicating warmth. Back then, I was agonizing over how two alphas could ever be together. Looking at it now, I guess I don't need to worry about that anymore. Feeling those hands acting up under the water again, Arthur's face flushed a furious red. He slammed his fist against the man's solid chest. If you wanted to find me, couldn't you just contact me directly? Why the hell did you have to go through a middleman? The mere thought of his uncle snatching that massive 20% commission made Arthur's heart bleed out. Christopher let out a muffled grunt of pain, swiftly catching that fist and wrapping it in his own palm, kneading it gently. I couldn't reach you. Arthur froze. Right. To save every last penny, he had swapped his phone plan to the absolute cheapest option years ago. His old number had been dead for a long time. Hold on. Arthur narrowed his eyes, his guard shooting back up. So you knew from the very beginning that I was a beta and couldn't have kids. Christopher's movements visibly stalled. A second later, that massive hand slid slowly down, his blistering palm pressing against Arthur's flat stomach, rubbing it with breathtaking intimacy. The room ignited once more with that intoxicating honey, thick, dark orange halo. You're a beta whose presentation failed later in life. It's not completely impossible. The man's low, gravelly voice vibrated right against his ear, dripping with an inescapable suggestion. Let's just try again. Days later, the early morning sun pierced through the floor to ceiling windows, scattering a tranquil pool of gold across the rosewood desk in the study. Arthur refused to just be a parasite living off someone else. He was right in the middle of plotting to go do grunt work at his uncle's new bike shop when Christopher saw right through his thoughts. Want to come to my company? Christopher asked, leaning back in his executive chair, his impossibly long legs crossed casually. Arthur bit down hard on his lower lip, his eyes dimming. A high school dropout with the utterly mediocre status of a beta. Going to a top-tier conglomerate like that would only make him the laughingstock of the entire building. Seeing his spine go rigid in silence, Christopher didn't push. He simply opened a drawer, pulled out a glossy, fresh inked university admission brochure, and slid it smoothly across the polished desk right in front of Arthur. How about going to school, then? Arthur's pupils blew wide open. The second his fingertips brushed the edge of the paper, they began to tremble uncontrollably. But you don't need to worry about a single thing. Just treat it as pre-employment training provided by the firm. Propping his chin on one hand, Christopher's bottomless eyes perfectly reflected the brilliant morning light. The pale gold halo wrapped around him was like the warm spring sun, effortlessly melting away every last trace of Arthur's deep-seated inferiority and restless anxiety. All you need to focus on right now is getting your grades up. Christopher leaned in slightly, a breathtakingly tender, hopeful smile curling his lips. His voice was absolute, anchoring, and overflowing with deep devotion. I'm truly looking forward to the day we work together. Arthur, I'll be waiting for you. Extra chapter. Ever since the runaway incident, Christopher's gaze had become like an invisible chain, locking Arthur securely within his inescapable orbit. It was as if he was terrified that the second he blinked, his cunning little beta would vanish into thin air all over again. The sheer suffocating weight of that heavy, scorching stare was starting to wear Arthur down. Desperate to carve out just a few days of peace, He sat up straight on the plush living room sofa and right in front of Christopher, boldly yanked up the hem of his pajama shirt. Sunlight spilled through the floor to ceiling windows, illuminating the soft, slightly rounded curve of his lower belly, a direct result of his recent days of lavish feasting. Actually, that medical report wasn't lying, Arthur said. Swallowing a twinge of guilt, he forced on a deadpan, utterly serious poker face, locking eyes with the alpha as if it were gospel truth. "I'm due any day now. We can't sleep in the same bed right now." Christopher was visibly thrown off by this absolute, biologically impossible nonsense. The tightly coiled, dark gold current in the air stuttered for a fraction of a second, bleeding out into streaks of a soft, slightly panicked pale, gold halo. He leaned down, his massive, sculpted hand pressing carefully against that soft stretch of skin. As he gently massaged the plush curve of Arthur's stomach, his bottomless eyes were actually swimming with a rare, naked vulnerability. "When are you due?" he asked in a low whisper, the blistering heat of his palm making Arthur's stomach tingle. "In a week." Arthur completely pulled the timeline out of thin air, even having the audacity to arch an expectant brow. "And after that, I'm going to need a full month of postpartum recovery. So, go ahead and get my room and nutritional meals sorted out." Whether driven by a desperate need to make up for all the lost years, or simply blinded by an alpha's fierce, protective instinct, Christopher swallowed the laughably flawed lie whole. He obediently moved his things into the adjoining guest room, leaving Arthur with a full, glorious week of sleeping in absolute, undisturbed peace. Inside that cozy, winter-warmed bedroom, the air seemed to float with shattered specks of gold, like the comforting scent of sun-baked wood. But the good days always end too fast. In the blink of an eye, the deadline arrived. Night had fallen heavily, and only a single warm orange wall lamp illuminated the bedroom. Breaking his recent routine, Christopher knocked on the door. Only when the towering silhouette stepped inside did Arthur remember that his fabricated due date was tonight. Christopher's eyes were brimming with unconcealed anxiety. The dark gold shadows around him rippled with every breath he took, carrying a suffocating, almost melting level of devotion. He insisted that he had to stay by the bed tonight, just in case. "No need. I've got it." Arthur rejected him with righteous conviction. Without even a flutter of his eyelashes, he shut the door right in the man's face, snapping the deadbolt with a sharp click. Then, utterly devoid of guilt, he sank back into the warm covers and slept like a log until broad daylight. Morning came. Brilliant sunlight pierced through the hallway windows, scattering a floor full of shattered gold. Rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, Arthur opened the door, only for his toes to nearly trip over a massive obstacle. He sucked in a sharp breath, freezing completely in place. Christopher was sitting right there on the floor, having spent the entire night guarding the door with his back against the freezing wall. At the sound of the door opening, the alpha slowly raised his head. His usually sharp, breathtaking features were etched with sheer exhaustion, the heavy dark circles under his eyes screamingly obvious in the morning light. The dull, warm light in the air instantly boiled over the second Christopher's gaze swept over him, warping into layers of a dangerous, teasing dark orange ripple. "You're awake?" Christopher arched a brow, a dangerous half-smile playing on his lips. His long, powerful fingers caught Arthur's slender wrist with terrifying precision. His bottomless gaze shot straight past Arthur's shoulder, scanning the empty room. "Where's the baby?" Arthur shrank back guiltily, the morning light and sheer panic forcing a faint flush to the corners of his eyes. Twitching his lips, he plastered on the most innocent, impossibly obedient smile he could muster, letting a sickeningly sweet word slip from his mouth. "Daddy." Christopher let out a breathless, exasperated laugh at the sheer audacity of that brush. "Oh." The still, warm, gold halo in the room violently detonated, shifting into a web of scorching, inescapable vines. With a sweep of his long arm, he locked his hand around Arthur's soft, pale waist, pulling him back into the room with irresistible dominating force. His low, gravelly voice dropped right against Arthur's ear, heavy with a dark promise of punishment. "Don't call me that right now. Save it. You're going to scream it for me later."
This story is just too sweet. I absolutely love Christopher's character. Has deeply devoted, yet completely dominating. From the very beginning he knew Arthur's true identity. Yet, he didn't expose him, nor did he choose to reveal who he really was right off the bat. On one hand, he wanted to see if Arthur still remembered him. On the other hand, I think he was afraid that if he laid all his cards on the table before they had any real emotional connection, he wouldn't be able to claim Arthur so quickly. As for Arthur, plunging from a carefree, wealthy young master down to a heavily indebted bottom-tier beta whose presentation failed due to sheer exhaustion, the crushing weight of life gave him incredible adaptability and a fiercely pragmatic mindset. Because of this, the brilliant Christopher saw right through Arthur's nature. He chose to play along with the sugar daddy game to rapidly lock Arthur into his inescapable orbit. He knew that a desperate, money-hungry Arthur would never turn down a job with such a massive payout and seemingly minimal effort. And things played out exactly as Christopher predicted. The second he heard about the opportunity, Arthur didn't hesitate to forge an Omega identity and take the job. Even when he realized his patron was nothing like the frail old man he had imagined, Arthur didn't turn around and walk away. Instead, for the sake of that fat paycheck, he bit the bullet and kept up the act. He has this wild weed-like resilience and cunning street smarts baked into his bones. He could lie through his teeth about being pregnant just to get some rest, and meticulously observe the mansion's daily routines to map out an escape plan. But beneath that pragmatic money, obsessed exterior, Arthur hides a deeply soft and insecure heart. When faced with the job opportunity Christopher offered, Arthur felt a wave of crushing inferiority over being a high school dropout. His like a severely wounded stray cat, so used to wandering and suffering that when faced with sudden, absolute devotion, his first instincts are doubt, fear, and running away. But the moment has given absolute security, he quickly shows his true colors, even acting out with a spoiled, adorable kind of bratty entitlement. And Christopher gave Arthur exactly that, absolute security. He showed Arthur an almost obsessive level of spoiling and endless patience. Whether it was Arthur's deliberately difficult dietary demands, his crazy revenge, shopping sprees, or that ridiculously flawed due date lie, Christopher swallowed it all whole. He even played along to the point of sitting on the floor and guarding his door all night. He didn't just take care of Arthur's daily life, he paved the way for his future. Every single time Arthur tried to break the rules, test the waters, or run away, he ultimately fell right back into Christopher's gentle yet entirely unbreakable web of control. Arthur finally found where he belongs, and Christopher got back the one person he always wanted to protect. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.